The air was made of glass that winter. In the silent fields of Poland, riders stood frozen upright on their horses, their armor cracked with frost, their eyes pale as stone. At first, the villagers thought they were statues. Then one of the horses collapsed, shattering the illusion with a hollow thud. These were Mongols, the same riders who had burned half of Europe, now frozen where they stood, mouths open as if still screaming into the wind. A group of peasants gathered around, whispering prayers and curses. One man hung a loaf of bread from a spear and scrawled a sign beside it, "Not made from human flesh, like Mongol food." They laughed as ravens circled above. No songs, no mourning, just a bitter joy that the nightmare had ended. Europe, once terrified, now looked upon its former conquerors with disgust. The invincible horde had come again, and this time it was Europe that had learned how to kill monsters. For decades, the Mongols had seemed unstoppable. An endless tide of horsemen sweeping across kingdoms, burning cities, and turning thrones into graves. Europe had called them demons, and for good reason. Where they rode, the world turned to ash. But by the winter of 1259, something had changed. The people who once fled now stood waiting. The same terror that had scarred their fathers had taught them how to fight back, not with pride, but with patience, with silence, with cold. From Krakow to the Carpathians, villages emptied before the horde arrived, wells were poisoned, bridges burned, and livestock infected. It was as if the land itself had turned against its invaders. And when the Mongols entered Poland that winter, they found no armies waiting, only a dead country whispering through the snow. "You're not welcome here." This was no longer a Europe trembling in fear. This was the ghost that had learned to haunt its hunter. By the mid-13th century, Europe had learned to fear a single name: the Mongols. To the east, kingdoms had fallen like sandcastles before a storm. Cities that once stood proud, Kiev, Krakow, Pest, lay in ashes. The tales that reached Western Europe were beyond comprehension. Riders who appeared from the mist, struck like thunder, and vanished before the dust settled. No army could stop them. No fortress could withstand them. The invincible empire of Genghis Khan seemed unstoppable, a force of nature rather than men. But Europe was changing. The chaos of the Crusades had ended, and the age of iron and discipline had begun. The Holy Roman Empire, the Poles, the Hungarians, all had seen enough destruction to understand that survival now depended not on faith or pride, but strategy. They watched the Mongols, studied their movements, and began to adapt. For the first time, the Europeans refused to be predictable. In the royal courts of Hungary and Poland, whispers grew louder. Spies spoke of the Mongols' patterns, their need for open plains, their reliance on lightning-fast cavalry, their arrogance in believing no enemy could outthink them. The Europeans realized that brute force would never defeat the horsemen of the steppes, so they turned to something the Mongols had never encountered: traps. Under the leadership of commanders like King Bela IV of Hungary and the Polish Duke Henry the Pious, Europe began constructing a new defense, one not made of walls but of plans. Villages were emptied and set ablaze before the Mongols arrived. Bridges were destroyed, wells poisoned, fields burned. It was a cruel tactic, but it left the invaders without supplies. The Mongols, used to feeding off conquered lands, suddenly found themselves starving in unfamiliar terrain. Meanwhile, European blacksmiths worked day and night, reforging their weapons. Heavy plate armor, long spears, and crossbows replaced old crusader gear. This wasn't about holy war anymore. This was about survival. The Europeans were transforming from prey into predators. In the frozen early months of 1241, scouts brought word that Mongol banners were approaching once more. The horsemen of Batu Khan and Subutai, the most brilliant generals of their time. But this time, they were entering a land that had been watching them closely, waiting patiently. The kings of Europe had learned the Mongols' rhythm, and now they would break it. As torches flickered along castle walls and church bells tolled through the night, Europe prepared for its greatest gamble. The hunters were becoming the hunted. The invincible army of the East was about to face something it had never known before, an enemy that had learned to think like them, move like them, and most dangerously of all, wait for them. The war of survival had begun. Not on the open steppe, but in the minds of men who refused to kneel. The first clash wasn't fought with swords or arrows. It was fought with fear. When the Mongols entered Europe again, they expected chaos. They expected peasants running, kings hiding, and cities surrendering. But what they found instead was silence. Empty villages, burnt fields, no livestock, no grain. Their horses pawed at the frozen ground, hungry and restless. Their scouts returned with nothing but confusion. It felt unnatural, as if the land itself had turned against them. Subutai, the Mongol mastermind, recognized the game. "They're watching us," he muttered to Batu Khan as they stood atop a hill overlooking the abandoned plains of Hungary. "They've learned." The Mongol warlord's eyes narrowed. For the first time, he saw in Europe something unfamiliar: patience. The Mongols thrived on motion, on panic, on forcing enemies to react. But Europe refused to play its old role. Days passed without a fight. Supply lines grew thinner, tempers shorter. Horses died from exhaustion. Even the mighty Mongol discipline began to waver. The men whispered that the forests themselves were cursed, that the souls of the dead Europeans haunted the night. And then came the sounds: distant horns in the fog, faint church bells, the echo of hooves that never seemed to end. The Europeans were using psychological warfare, striking not with armies, but with the unseen. They made the Mongols feel hunted. Every sound, every flicker of light, every whisper of wind through the trees made the riders grip their bows tighter. In secret, the European commanders had ordered their troops to strike only at night, and never from the same direction twice. Small bands of horsemen would appear, loose a few arrows, and vanish. They left behind false trails, misleading fires, and abandoned wagons filled with corpses dressed in armor, to make it seem like whole battalions had perished. Subutai's men began to distrust their own scouts. "The enemy is everywhere," one soldier said. "And nowhere," another replied. That uncertainty, that single doubt, was something the Mongols had never experienced before. For decades they had been the masters of terror. Now they were tasting it themselves. The psychological strain deepened. Nights grew colder. Rumors spread that European monks had cursed their armies. Batu Khan ordered public executions for anyone spreading fear. But fear cannot be killed by the sword. It spreads quietly, invisibly, like smoke through a camp. At dawn one morning, the Mongols reached a valley where they thought the Hungarians had retreated. But all they found were wooden stakes arranged in strange formations, with symbols painted in ash, a message from the Europeans. No words, no banners, just a silent warning. "We are waiting." Subutai stared at the message and said nothing. But deep down he knew the war had shifted. The Mongols were no longer the hunters. They were walking into a trap woven not from steel, but from fear and cunning. The Invincible had met its mirror. By the spring of 1241, Europe had reached its breaking point. Entire kingdoms stood on the edge of collapse. But while fear spread across the continent, a cold, calculated fire burned in the hearts of a few commanders. Men who had watched their lands burn and their families slaughtered years before. They were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting for revenge. King Bela IV of Hungary had spent months gathering what remained of his forces, knights hardened by crusades, peasants turned warriors, mercenaries who fought for coin, and soldiers who fought for vengeance. They had no illusions. No one believed they could defeat the Mongols in a fair fight, but fairness was no longer the goal. Meanwhile, Batu Khan's army, once swift and unstoppable, was slowing down. Exhaustion, hunger, and confusion had gnawed at their edges. Their scouts sent conflicting reports, and their maps were useless in the flooded spring marshlands of central Hungary. What they didn't know was that Bela had chosen the battlefield himself, the plains of Mohi near the Sajo River. It looked like a perfect place for the Mongols: open fields, wide skies, room to maneuver. But beneath that calm surface lay months of preparation. The Hungarians had studied Mongol patterns, how they charged, how they encircled, how they trapped. So Bela turned their tactics against them. Hidden ditches, spiked pits, and choke points disguised as escape routes waited in the fog. On the night of April 10th, the Mongols approached the Sajo Bridge. Their engineers, experts in stealth, began crossing quietly under the moonlight until a sudden flare lit up the sky. Bells rang from the Hungarian camp. The bridge erupted in fire. Arrows rained down from both sides. The air filled with screams and smoke. Subutai quickly adapted, ordering a flanking maneuver to strike from the west. But this time the Hungarians were ready. For the first time in memory, a European army had predicted a Mongol move. They countered with heavy cavalry, smashing through the flanking units with sheer force. The Battle of Mohi became a storm of chaos, fire, mud, blood, and steel. The Mongols unleashed their signature feigned retreats, drawing the Europeans in. But Bela's men refused to chase. They held formation, waiting, forcing the Mongols to fight where the traps waited. Horses stumbled into ditches, men fell onto spikes. Crossbow bolts pierced through armor. For the first time, the Mongols' precision began to crumble. Batu Khan himself charged into the melee furious. "Break them!" he shouted, but his voice was lost amid the screams. European knights, covered in mud and blood, fought like men possessed. Each strike, each arrow, was a cry of vengeance for the cities burned, the families lost, the pride shattered. And then came the turning point. Subutai signalled for his elite reserve, the guard that had never failed him. They moved to flank the Hungarians again, only to find the bridge behind them collapsing. Bela had ordered it burned. The Mongols were trapped between fire and river. For hours they fought like cornered beasts. The night sky glowed red with flames. Corpses floated in the Sajo. When dawn broke, the invincible Mongol army, the terror of the world, had bled. Thousands lay dead. Their banners, once feared across continents, were trampled into the mud. But the cost was unbearable. Hungary was shattered. Villages lay empty, cities silent. King Bela escaped barely alive, yet he had achieved the impossible. He had wounded the invincible. The Mongols would never forget it. As Subutai rode from the battlefield, his armor blackened with soot, he looked back one last time. His empire had faced countless enemies, Chinese dynasties, Persian kings, Russian princes. None had made the Mongols bleed like this. None had made them doubt their own strength. Europe had learned the Mongol way and used it against them. Revenge had reshaped the battlefield, and for the first time in history, the Mongols rode away not as conquerors, but as survivors. When the fires of Mohi faded, Europe lay in ruins, but it was a ruin that still stood. The Mongols, for all their strength, had discovered a truth they'd never faced before. Even the greatest empire can be broken by patience, unity, and time. King Bela IV escaped to the Adriatic coast, carrying little more than a wounded army and a story that would echo for centuries. He rebuilt his kingdom not through conquest, but through resilience. Fortresses rose across Hungary, built from stone thick enough to withstand siege engines. Roads were widened, rivers fortified, alliances forged between rivals who once refused to even speak. Europe, once fragmented and frightened, began to evolve, united not by faith or greed, but by the shared memory of what the Mongols had done. Far to the east, Batu Khan and Subutai returned to their camp in silence. The empire that had never known failure now carried a scar. Reports from spies told them Europe was rebuilding, stronger, smarter, and no longer afraid. Batu wanted to return and finish what they had started, but word from Karakorum stopped him cold. The great Khan Ogedei was dead. The empire needed its generals back, and so the Mongols turned east. Their armies withdrew from Europe like a dark tide retreating from the shore. To the kings and peasants of the West, it felt like divine intervention, as if heaven itself had saved them. But history tells another truth. Europe wasn't spared by miracles. It was spared because it learned. The Mongols' withdrawal marked the beginning of a new era. The survivors of Mohi became the teachers of a generation, commanders who studied not glory, but strategy, not prayer, but preparation. From the ashes of defeat rose new doctrines of war, flexible formations, intelligence networks, and fortified borders that would define Europe's military for centuries. In time, even the Mongols came to respect what they had found in the West. Subutai himself reportedly said, "They learned faster than we expected." And he was right. The same Europe that once trembled before the hooves of Mongol horses would one day stand as the most powerful force on earth. Centuries later, historians would look back on the Battle of Mohi not as a victory, but as a turning point. The moment when fear gave way to knowledge, when survival turned into defiance, and when the myth of Mongol invincibility began to fade. Europe had faced the storm and endured. The Invincible had been wounded, and in that wound, history changed forever. For generations, the Mongols were seen as unstoppable, a whirlwind of speed, strategy, and terror that reshaped continents. But on the blood-soaked plains of Hungary, something changed. Europe, for the first time, had refused to break. The so-called barbarians of the West had outlasted the storm that had swept through Asia, the Middle East, and Russia. And though the scars of the Mongol invasion would last for centuries, so too would the lessons it taught. Because in the end, the Mongols weren't destroyed by swords or armies. They were undone by adaptation. The same adaptability that once made them great now lived in those who survived them. Europe learned to fight differently. It learned to think strategically, to unite under pressure, to turn fear into fuel. From the ashes of defeat came evolution. A civilization now ready to defend itself against any empire, any invader, any impossible threat. And perhaps that's the true legacy of this clash. It wasn't just the day the Mongols were stopped. It was the day Europe became something new, cunning, coordinated, and unstoppable in its own right. As the centuries rolled on, Europe would rise to dominate the very lands the Mongols once ruled. Empires would come and go, kings would rise and fall, but the lesson of Mohi remained carved into history. No power is eternal, no army invincible. The Mongols rode west as legends. They returned east as mortals, and in that single truth, in that moment when the unstoppable met the unyielding, the balance of the world quietly shifted forever. You love uncovering how small decisions change the fate of empires. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about why it mattered.